Ruski Mir has been a most controversial point during the last years, but before the war in Ukraine, 2014, nobody really took it seriously. The initial problem with Ruski Mir is the problem of defining its meaning. Ruski is supposed to be distinct from Rossiyski, and as such it includes not just Russia, but definitely also Belarus, White Russia, and Ukraine, which was called Little Russia by the Muscovites. Though Mir is harder to define. The word in itself means both world and peace, and as such it refers to the imperial concept of pax. Together they seem to be related to the ancient idea of a Russian empire, but there are no clear sources for how to define it, and the same with ideology supposedly to support the words together. Various sources give various conceptual messages, and the concept seems to exist in the shadows rather than in any solid discourse. Yes, Ruski Mir does not belong to a single discourse, and there is no single definition of its semantic content, but, and this is most important, it has a meaning. The concept is fluid, but exists within a game that belongs to the category of identity politics. And as such, it also has a twin, which I would designate as identity theology, which has become the hallmark of Russian theology in the 21st century. The chief theologian within this game is no less than Patriarch Kirill himself, whom I have followed since 2007 in sermons and speeches. Others who has a much more personal relationship with Patriarch Kirill can give a more nuanced understanding of why he took this path, which certainly has an important explanatory value. But what I have found by just looking at his sermons and speeches is a gradual development away from discourse toward the preference of an identity theology. You can find my analysis of Kirill's sermons more extended in another article. Today, I will focus on the very phenomenon of identity theology and the dangers associated with it, and I will use Patriarch Kirill as an example. Identity politics was coined as a concept in the late 20th century, even though the phenomenon has probably existed as far as humans have created and nurtured various identities that has transcended the tribal existence of human relations. There are three conditions that defines the phenomenon of identity politics. Firstly, the general approach of identity politics is the attempt of creating political agendas that are based upon race, gender, social background, social class, religion, or sexual orientation. Secondly, these agendas also display that those advocating these agendas experience or claim that a certain group, either their own or another group, is systematically oppressed. This makes identity revolutionary and transformative. Thirdly, identity politics have a tendency to expand the scope of a problem by connecting the original and primary oppression of a particular race, ethnic group, gender, economic class, etc., with the existent world order, which in some way or another must be dismantled or transformed in order for both a particular group or similar groups to be emancipated. This also amounts to a fourth possible consequence, the understanding of emancipation as connected with liberation of a certain group, which becomes visible in how universalism is rejected, arguing that emancipation is primarily connected with a particular group and the uniqueness of that group. Identity theology is just another form of identity politics, but with metaphysical claims that often creates a dichotomy between the present situation and the future ideal situation. In between these two poles, identity theology manifests itself as identifying a particular ethnic group or particular religion or church or an oppressed group as acting as a vehicle for transforming the present reality into its future destiny. Here we should pause for a moment and make a distinction between political theology and identity theology. Take, for example, the Afro-American liberation movement and its critique against the political agenda based on racial oppression. This is not identity politics per se. But if it evolves into identifying the particular group as unique and the oppression particular, it quickly reaches the level of identity politics. And identity theology develops in the same way. Identity theology embraces the idea of a particular identity as foundational for human existence and the idea of diversity as manifested in opposition. Identity is different from discourse. In discourse, we aspire to reach common understanding and mutual agreement where concepts are defined and meaning is exhausted. Identity, instead, is a disclosure of what is unique and what makes us different from each other. At the same time, identity escapes all definitions. Take, for example, Mr. Jones. If you describe Mr. Jones as a gentleman with black hair and blue eyes and yet 100 other characteristics, it does not equal Mr. Jones. Instead, the unique Mr. Jones always escape a full definition. It's the same with any particular religious community. Even if you can describe the faith of a community, particular characteristics and similar, it escapes a full definition. Those who want to advocate the unique identity of a church often refer to the alterity of a church, eschatology, mystery, and similar. As long as these remain open without being defined, they give a healthy balance to the definitions. But when they become reified ontological realities, we enter into the world of identity theology. The essentialist notion of identity is common for both identity politics as well as identity theology. But with the former, it is much easier to argue against this reification, or Verdinglichung, if you use the German concept, of a disclosure that cannot become a thing. It is different with identity theology, that feeds on a metaphysical understanding of reality common within religions, but disclosures can become things through what we could label ontological reification. This is the reason why religion has been and continues to be so important for politics, because it provides politics with what they cannot provide on their own, a reified understanding of identity. This has caused theological conflicts along social identity with numerous examples in church history, as well as provided nationalists with the necessary characteristics for national identity. Ruský mír, in the present context of collaboration between church and state, is both a vehicle for identity politics as well as for identity theology. As identity politics, it aspires to create a Lebensraum for all Russians dispersed in various countries. The Soviet Union tried to dismantle various local national identities, but Russia remained as a core within the Soviet Union. It remained local, but with imperial designations as the protector of a federation of Soviet states, at least until world communism would be victorious. When the Soviet Union was collapsing, it left Russia nominally or politically in ruins. Its ancient role of protector was quickly obliterated, which was confirmed first by the bombings of Serbia, where Russia was sidestepped, which virtually over the world left Russia deposed as protector of the Slavic peoples. Later on, reaffirmed by Barack Obama, saying that Russia is no longer a superpower, only a regional power. In a previous study between 2008 and 2014, we studied the effect this had on the level of the people, where we found extremely high levels of anomie, in exact the social effect of a general loss of meaning. An anomic society has two possible outcomes. Either the society becomes extremely authoritarian or it becomes extremely cynical. If you compare Russia with Serbia, we see high levels of anomie in both countries. Both countries have followed a similar development, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Yugoslavia. But the outcome is different. In Russia, the effect is extremely authoritarian, where absent authorities like Patriarch Kirill, who had before the war 2014 78% of the support by the people, or President Putin, who had 73% support by the people. And while local authorities, such as the mayor or representative institutions like the Duma, who had only 23% support by the people, has low support. In Serbia, instead, all authorities are discouraged. And we instead have a similar effect as with the Trumpists, where you want leaders who reveal hypocrisy with the idea that they are at least honest, even if they are also corrupted. But, hey, everyone is corrupted. That is the general argument. This changed social setting in Russia, which in many ways started with the bombings of Serbia, paved the way for Putin. Though, the bombings did not create Putin. A lot can be said of his development, but in a nutshell, he is a political leader similar to Andropov, who coined the expression that the real leader does not need to have opinions or ideologies. He acts while others can talk. Immediately when Putin assumed the throne, he was eager to find someone who could talk to the nation and tried various solutions, but none really worked. The major problem was that the Soviet Union was lost and Russia had nothing to protect anymore. Rossiyski, or Russian, was limited to a political entity within particular borders that had been accepted by the previous government and ratified in international agreements. When another throne pretendant assumed the parallel throne, things began to quickly move toward a solution. Independent from Putin, Patriarch Kirill already in the late years as Metropolitan had begun to talk about the Rus identity from which we derive Ruski, as contained within the Russian Orthodox Church. Gradually, the message of Patriarch Kirill merged with the leadership of Putin. Kirill became the spokesperson for a new Russia that transcended borders without transgressing international agreements. Once again, Russia would become the protector of something that was bigger than themselves, the Rus world, or Ruski Mir. Both for the church as well as for the state, this was a win-win situation, confirming yet again the greatness of Russia. Consider then the disastrous challenge posed by Little Russia, Ukraine, when they wanted to have their own canonical church, independent from the protection of Moscow. In Moscow, this was understood as an act of ethnophilitism, when already canonical territory is defined by national ethnic aspirations and not by the worldwide unit of orthodoxy, similar to the accusations made by the Ecumenical Patriarch against the Moscow Patriarchate in a diaspora. Both examples here could be labeled as a kind of struggle concerning ethnophilities. But Ruski Mir, in fact, feeds on the idea, which has given rise also to aspirations in the Fanar, the definition of a certain territory as protected by a particular group, in the latter case, the Greek nation, and in the former case, the Russian nation, and equally, in the former case, often supported by Pan-Hellenism, and in the former case, often supported by Pan-Slavism. Though in both cases, they would reject in principle the idea that two churches can exist within the same canonical territory, but with different understandings of what it means, canonical territory. Anyway, Ruski Mir, when it is attached to the Russian Orthodox Church, depends on the idea that the Moscow Patriarchate has clearly defined borders, in exact the former Soviet Union, where several nations can coexist equally. But attached to the Russian state, it evolves to a different level. Then the church becomes an instrument for creating an identity between nations, which is an identity that expands beyond the ecclesiastical institution. And when this is supported by the church, we encounter identity theology, which is based on the particular identity of the Rus with the unique mission of uniting the world, most often based on various understandings of Sabornost. Patriarch Kirill described this in the following way in his speech to the World Russian Congress in Tyumen, 2014, the same year as Crimea was annexed. Quote, "The gospel says, every kingdom that is divided becomes desolate, and a city or family that is divided cannot exist. To avoid this disaster within ourselves, we need to identify three challenges that challenge this council. These problems relate to each other and can together constitute a vertical hierarchy. 1. Ensure unity and consensus within the Russian people, Without this mutual understanding and unity cannot be achieved at the international level. 2, ensure the unity between the Russian people and the Russian state, since the collapse of the Russian state in the 21st century was based on various external factors and influences which caused the Russian people to conflict with their own state. 3, ensure unity and understanding between Russian people and other brotherly peoples in our country. End quote. Prior to the annexation of Crimea, Kirill was less concerned with the Ruski Mir than with the internal unity within the political territory of Russia. In this quotation, Kirill used Rossiyski and not Ruski. At the same time, the reason for this is also displayed, where Kirill urged the Russians to be united. Without the internal unity among Russians themselves, they cannot achieve a broader unity. This is repeated several times by Kirill prior to the annexation in 2014. The increased focus on Ruski Mir is visualized by the declaration on Ruski Mir in the World Russian Congress 2014, November 11th. And that's the start of a new message. Now Kirill begins to speak on the unity of a Russian world using Ruski instead of Rossiyski. And by doing that, he enters into the world of identity theology. Ruski Mir quickly evolves after the declaration as a definition of post-Soviet space, which still exists in a common historical memory and in the Russian culture and in the Russian language. Kirill defines this space as a, quote, notion of civilization serving spiritual, cultural, and ethical dimensions of human personality, unquote. And as such, Kirill argues that it has nothing to do, note, nothing to do with politics. Instead, he argues that this is a reality Russians have nurtured through centuries. Kirill himself is very eager to argue that this space has a spirit of tolerance and respect for dissenters, but only if they can see this unique cultural space and its, quote, spiritual and cultural elements as their own, unquote. This view of Ruski Mir is further supported by Igumen Philip, one of the spokespersons for the Moscow Patriarchate in Brussels, who sees the birth of a Russian world in the Kievan Rus that continues in the Moscow Duchy and further on in the Tsar Empire and existed underneath the surface of the Soviet Empire, where, quote, representatives of different ethnoses, cultures, and religions live together and create a unique space for cooperation, unquote. The uniqueness of the Russian world is the key word for both Kirill and Philip, which corresponds well with the first criteria for identity theology, though uniqueness is not enough. Ruski Mir also creates borders with the presumption that this uniqueness is threatened. The declaration says that no one can become a member of a Russian community, now referring to Ruski, if they don't, quote, consider oneself to be a Ruski man and speak and think in Russian and regard Orthodox Christianity as the basis of a national spiritual culture, unquote. And then later on in the declaration, quote, feel solidarity with the history of a Russian nation, unquote. These borders reveals an ontological reification of identity, where elements of identity are primordial, given in advance, and not something we achieve together. If we stop there and just would accept that we all have a right to choose what kind of culture we would like to identify ourselves with, it could provide a balance to objective criteria by adding subjective and intimately personal criteria for society, which is precisely what freedom for religion is all about. Though, identity theology turns subjective and aesthetical perspectives into things, objective things. Ruski Mir is then not a choice of individual or a social agreement, but an objective fact. As Kirill stated in his address in regard to the situation in Ukraine 2014, September 6, quote, Eastern Slavs who are united under one faith and one historical tradition to possess their common spiritual and cultural space witness today an ongoing battle for this space, unquote. In a later address, Kirill also defined Ruski Mir as an occupied territory in Ukraine, not because the Ukrainians had so chosen, but because they were victims of an, quote, evil from outside who do not belong to us, unquote. Ruski Mir becomes so petrified in the end that it becomes more important to defend this space than human rights and even human values. But dignity becomes a code for this defense. Kirill had already, 2006, April 4th, addressed this as a metropolitan in the World Russian Congress, long before it reached the Western public or the Russian populace. Quote, "On the other hand, however, we can see that the human rights concept is being used to cover falsehood, untruth, and offense of religious and ethnic values. Besides, the complex of human rights and freedom has come gradually to integrate ideas which contradict not only Christian, but also traditional ethical ideas of man in general," unquote. The problem with identity theology is that individual and aesthetic opinions become objective facts, seemingly primordial and therefore not possible to discuss. In reality, they are either invented by someone or at least juxtaposed by someone. Ruski Mir is similar to the identity of a person. It exhausts every definition. We can see the streams of Ruski Mir in the past, history, and culture, but we can't predict fully its future nor identify its present shape. Nevertheless, through the intervention by agents, it becomes reified, where the same agents want to take control of the future by identifying the present. This identification in politics is criticized as being founded on false essentialist notions, but in theology, such a critique seems to be fluid, since essentialist notions are often the core of theological expressions. The response then is to claim that certain opinions are heretical, and in regard to Ruski Mir, the argument has been that this is an example of ethnophilitis. But Ruski Mir as such is no different than other historical projects, such as the creation of a Greek nation or the Georgian nation, etc. In itself, Ruski Mir could be a positive project for preserving and developing common traits between various countries that share a common tradition, such as preserving Church Slavonic, the typical of a liturgy, the preservation of Orthodox culture tradition, all that we are usually proud to preserve. The problem is not Ruski Mir per se, but how it is used, or rather misused. Ruski Mir in its present context is not about preserving Orthodox tradition, values, or even civilization. Instead, it's about making Russia great again, to become an empire, and as such, theology is needed to create essentialist notions of national or imperial identity. Though, if we want to criticize Russia for this, we have to rewrite history, and especially the history of the Byzantine Church. The imperial vestige are visible in Orthodoxy, with bishops dressed as emperors, and with the history hailing the emperors to the sky. But yes, the present conflict in Russia and Ukraine forces us to rewrite history, but even more important, it forces us to reinterpret the present. What happens in Russia is sprinkled out in all of Orthodoxy, both here in Greece as well as in Ukraine, and we are all tainted by the color of identity theology that interpret the world in oppressed and oppressors, heretics and Orthodox, paving the way for war and animosity. Thank you.